Thank you, Director Elmendorf. Let me start out, if I could, by saying you've said repeatedly, your report shows that we're on a budget track that is unsustainable. Deficits are too high, too much debt. But you also say in this report that if we let the tax cuts expire, as is provided for in current law, and if we impose the spending cuts required by current law, economic growth, according to your analysis, will actually plunge. And we started out with Senator Toomey and I agreeing on one thing, that we got to have policies that strengthen economic growth. And yet you are saying that current law, which ends the Bush-era tax cuts at the end of this year, and current law also imposes spending cuts, sequestration that is in line, that would cut economic growth about in half. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
So, you know, I think it is very confusing to people because it sounds like double talk to them. How can it be that on the one hand, we're saying deficits and debt are a big problem, but on the other hand, if we cut spending and raise revenue, which over time will reduce deficits, that if we did it now, it will dramatically reduce economic growth and make our economic situation worse? How can both those things be true?
As you know, Mr. Chairman, it is not double talk, but it is complicated. In the short term, especially given the state of our economy today, the constraint on output and jobs is really the demand for goods and services, which plummeted in the financial crisis and recession and is only slowly coming back. Over the medium term and long term, the constraint on output in this economy is not particularly the demand for goods and services. It is the ability of the economy to supply those goods and services. It is the size and skill of the labor force, the quantity of capital with which they work, the productivity with which the labor and capital are combined to produce output. This is actually a consensus part of economic thinking, that in the short term, in economies that have a lot of underused and unused people, factories, houses, and so on, that efforts to boost the demand for goods and services can help put people back to work. But that over time, the bigger issue is whether people are doing enough saving, whether there are people who are coming to work who can find jobs. And so what countries have found is that very rapid imposition of fiscal restraint tends, not always, but tends to slow economies in the short term. Now, some countries have no choice. I'm not trying to second guess the decisions made by policymakers in Europe. When countries can't sell their debt or fear that they may not be able to sell their debt tomorrow, then they sometimes need to make drastic changes in fiscal policy overnight. And in our issue brief on the risk of a fiscal crisis in this country a few years ago, we highlighted the fact that if one waits to address fiscal problems until the creditors won't lend you money anymore, that often happens right when the economies are weakest and it's hardest to address the problem. So once countries have gotten to that point, sometimes they have no choice but to make that sort of overnight change. But if one can plan ahead, then it helps households and businesses and state and local governments to adjust to the change in policies. I want to say this is not, in any case, an argument for deferring decision-making. There really isn't a downside to the Congress deciding how it wants to put the country on a sustainable fiscal path. The issue is, given a plan, how quickly should the pieces take effect? And there are reasons for waiting, which I'm laying out. There are also, of course, reasons for not waiting too long. We've written a lot and talked a lot about the dangers of the escalating debt. But there is a balancing act in how quickly the policies take effect.
So why wouldn't one conclude from what you've said here that the best policy in the short term would be to extend tax cuts, at least some significant part of the tax cuts, and defer some of the spending cuts, for example, part of the sequester, for several years, but right now agree to a plan that will raise revenue and cut spending so that at the end of the 10 years we've dramatically reduced deficits and reduced the growth of debt?
So I don't want to speak to a specific combination of policies that Congress might choose to extend or let expire. That's a decision for you. As you know, we've done analysis of the stimulative effects for output and employment of particular sets of policies, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But on your general point, I think agreement about how the country's budget will be put on a sustainable path would be a good thing for the economy in the short run, because it would give people some confidence that they knew where policies were headed, which is very hard to have in the current environment. And if a set of policies was put in place that put the country on a sustainable fiscal path, and people believed those policies would be allowed to take effect when they were scheduled to do so, then I think that would be a good thing for business investment and hiring and for consumer spending, and would help to boost the economy right away.
But wouldn't the logical conclusion of the testimony you've provided be that in the short term we should take steps that might actually increase deficits and debt if that was married with a longer-term plan that credibly, substantially reduced deficits and debt?
Well, yes, I think so, if I understand you right. The policies that would widen the deficit relative to the very sharp fiscal restraint in our current law baseline, relative to that benchmark, policies that widen the deficit for a few years would be beneficial for the economy over that period if they were, especially if they were, as you say, combined with a plan that later narrowed deficits relative to the current policy projections that we've shown you here. Combining those pieces is important because people might otherwise interpret short-term widening of the deficit as simply a precursor for further widening down the road. And so the proposal that you mentioned about having those pieces together, I think, would be the strongest, provide the strongest boost to economic activity in the short term.
But those longer steps to deal with deficits and debt would have to be credible and have to be an assurance that they were put in place.
Yes, I think we've written, and I've said in previous testimonies, that to make intended future actions matter for people's behavior today, they need to be credible. Part of that is they need to be specific, and they need to have, I think, reasonably widespread support, so that people didn't think that they would be quickly overturned down the road.